Welcome to Compliance Therapy with Igor Volovich, presented by Qmulos. Qmulos, converged continuous compliance. Get it together.
Compliance is not a technology problem; it is an assurance and technology problem. So it's just been interesting to see that evolution sort of change over time, where we're all sort of discovering that assurance has been needed all along, right?
Yeah, there's been this divergence, right? When we took compliance and we kind of made it its own separate function, its own separate domain, its own set of headaches, its own set of problems,
right?
Its own set of skills and technologies also, right?
Yeah.
Back in the day, we had GRCs and we had, folks running around and getting big things like Archer, the SAP of risk management, right?
Right.
With all the implementation challenges that entails, and I've been in those rooms many times where we talk about this and we say, well, there's going to be all this value, except the time to value is very significant. It's almost prohibitive, right? And so
absolutely.
Trying to do risk management now, and you're also trying to demonstrate compliance now, not 2-3 years from now.
Absolutely. I mean, talk about, the sort of specificity of skills that have grown around the domain of GRC, if you will. This has been an emerging debate in the DoD supply chain, where these businesses will come back and they'll say, I'm going to have to pay somebody basically to understand this stuff full time. And the sort of counter argument to that is, first of all, they say, I have to pay somebody to understand this stuff full time because it's very complex. And then they say, I shouldn't have to do that. Therefore, you should reduce the standard to a point at which I no longer need anybody to understand it for me. And that's a non-debate because of the fact that they're not designing the standard to make it, bite-sized. They're designing the standard for their assurances. Now, what's interesting about that is we don't say the same thing about accountants, right? And we also don't say the same thing about lawyers, right? We don't say the same thing about other formal disciplines that have very complex standards and bodies of knowledge that they need to work and as a craft for, a career. But as much as security has become, a thing that no one can ignore, we don't seem to have collectively made the jump to say, this is a domain that is worthy of being considered a craft that requires somebody to understand how the back end works. Like, how do the controls work? How do the regulations work? Because if you just leave it to the lawyers, you're going to be missing stuff. If you leave it to, nothing against accountants, but if you leave it to accountants, you end up with a framework like SOC, which is great, but probably not. It's not a universal solution. And so there's somewhere in the middle here where it's partly the perspective of the lawyers, it's partly a perspective of the accountants, it's partly a perspective of the engineers, where you're going to form this sort of emergent domain of GRC professionals, right? And unless we're living in a universe where somehow we are going to unwind NIST standards and they're just slowly going to go away, the reality is you're going to have people who understand what they mean, how they're written, how they look when they're actually implemented. I mean, it's just part of the security discipline, just like it would be for understanding the tax code, how you're going to integrate that into your business, right?
Yeah, I think there's a conversation to be had about the idea of not having to actually understand all of it, because simply it's impossible.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there are very few experts who operate at your level who take the trouble, right, to understand things to that level, that minute, granular function of each control, its implementation model, and also how do you verify and validate that it actually is in place and functioning as intended.
100%.
And I think that's a big challenge, and making that scalable is difficult. So you almost want some kind of a translation layer that
absolutely
sits there and really allows you to interpret every piece of technology you've got in place, whether it has a deterministic security function,
yeah,
or whether
absolutely,
it has a security value,
right?
And this is a control. Right.
Yes.
Through the
absolutely.
context of a particular framework. I think that's the big challenge. And I think a lot of folks are still struggling with making that, sense of it, but simply applying human controls and human capabilities, because it's just so tough.
Well, that's why, we were talking about this before we went live here was there's a lot of, first of all, I think that because the GRC compliance space is so unaddressed, there's a lot of room for disruption. There's a lot of room for change. I think you're going to see a lot of growth from a lot of different ideas that take root in that domain, because as everything has become security, the only real option that anybody has is more regulation, right? It's on a long enough timeline. There's more privacy regulation, there's more security regulation, there's more assurances in the supply chain that are required. And that takes the form of more and more GRC work. And so because it's been, so under addressed, you're going to see a lot of changes. And we were talking about, there's a lot of companies out there that are automating compliance. They're speeding it up. They're facilitating it. And to your point that you just made, we might be speeding up to a point where we don't know if it is as valuable as we thought it was. And so it takes both, right? We can't just stay in some paperwork drill once every 3 years thing. You need to automate it, make it faster, make it continuous, integrate it as much as possible. But once we do that, we're all going to have to ask the bigger question of, what exactly are we automating here? Is it giving us assurances? Is it giving us knowledge? Do I know more now that it's done than I did before it started? Hopefully the answer would be yes. That's why I think that the NIST style of having two sides of a control, the control explanation sort of part that people are most familiar with, and the decomposed control in the what they call the assessment objectives, the actual things that you need to check. They actually call them determination statements. Determine if this thing is in place, if this thing is in place, gives you that level of assurance. If you can speed it up, that's great. However, back to that idea of how NIST controls, and I would imagine that any control of any framework would fundamentally want to work, is that, NIST's fundamental idea is that your control environment exists to uphold your organizational policy. If you have controls in your environment that don't line up with the policy of your organization, why are they there? There's a good chance you're spending money on them, which, from just the basics means that you are spending money you don't need to. But we sort of end up reversing our way into it, where people show up, one day 171 shows up on your doorstep and the government says you have to do it. And they aren't really policy. The organization hasn't really considered their policy towards security. They haven't really thought about it yet. And you're handing them a set of controls that are inherently dependent on a, quasi-enlightened organization that has considered this problem. And it might be that when you hand them the standard, that's the very first time they've ever considered security, especially in a smaller organization, which is perfectly understandable. And so you end up with the cart before the horse, where people say, well, these are the things that I ought to implement. And then when you actually dig into the details of a NIST control, you'll find that it's really more of like a book of ad libs, where they'll have the controls and they'll say, well, you define this parameter and you define this time period and you define this recurring time frame and you define this. And you have to fill in the blanks of this very open-ended framework. And if you haven't thought about those things, then you pick up the document and you go, I have no idea what this is talking about. It feels like it's not complete, and it's not complete by design. What ends up happening is people go, man, compliance, that is just a waste of time. And you go, that is not the fault of compliance. Whatever that term means as an epithet, it means that you don't have the precursors ready to go to pick up this document that is designed for you to fill in and give you some assurances. So is that the document's fault? Maybe, from a design perspective. Is that the regulator's fault? Probably, because they didn't anticipate it. Is it your fault? It's probably a little bit your fault too. And when you start doing that and you realize that it's everybody's fault, well, then there's no one to really blame. It's just that we have to realize that we can't keep pointing fingers. We're going to have to figure out a different solution. And I'm not really sure what that is at this point within the GRC space, because basically every company you go to has, probably lower than average or less than desirable governance when it comes to security. And most compliance frameworks are built on the idea that that is not the case, that you have thought about what you want the governance of your company to look like. And if you're looking for a document, I do this thought experiment with people all the time. 171 is 110 controls. I think it's like 100 something pages. As far as NIST goes, those are rookie numbers. That's not a very big document at all.
Right.
But now imagine that you tasked NIST or some other standards body to come up with as flexible of a standard as possible for teaching you how to start a security program from scratch, like literally nothing in place, all the way up to governance-minded, sort of CISO-driven, leadership buy-in based security program. As it's an arbitrary distinction because it's not possible to do, but how big would that document be? Like if you were to write it down, it would be massive. It would be impossible, probably impossible to write. And so as a result, people keep sort of blaming compliance by the nature of these control standards. And I don't really think that's the root cause of the problem. So I don't know if that's going to convince anybody, but it's an easy argument to make, but I don't think that it is the only argument that can be made.
Yeah, I think, you made a lot of great points, of course, and I couldn't agree more. I think there's a question of trying to shoehorn compliance back into an organization and kind of do security through the lens of compliance versus the opposite, which is building a secure organization and then being hit with a compliance mandate that you simply go back to your controls and say, look, I just need to apply a different lens, a different framework, different mandate, different set of controls, but I can recognize them. And if you have that translation layer, whichever form it comes in, look, you can throw 100 ISOs at it who are super good, really great technologists, and also understand compliance, which is a unicorn, doesn't exist. Right. Let's imagine, let's live in a happy world of unicorns and butterflies, and imagine for a second that's real. And you can throw that army of ISOs who are super intelligent, highly trained, and by the way, haven't left your organization for cool guy stuff after 3 years, meaning, shuffling paperwork. Let's imagine all these possibilities. And say, okay, you can do that. Now, the reality is you don't have that. Nobody has that.
Right.
And I've never met a team of ISOs who was that universally well equipped to do these kinds of, make these kinds of decisions. And so you need some kind of a technology translation layer where you have the automation and the interpretation of controls, that you have data gathering that's happening on its own, right? Where you can automate that, where you can interpret the telemetry that you're getting from a perspective of compliance. And then as new mandates come in, you're not surprised. Nothing throws you for a whiplash.
Yep.
It's simply, hey, here's another thing that came down the pike. Got it. Let me apply that framework to my existing environments because I already understand all the technology that I have, not only from a perspective of a control within, let's say, 853 or any kind of a NIST framework. And once you do one, it's easier to do many others, right? So once you're on that path, it becomes exactly what you said. I think it's a matter of maturity. I think a lot of folks look at compliance as this responsive function. Right. And I think when we talk about proactive compliance, a lot of heads get turned sideways and people kind of do that, surprise doggy look. Like, what do you mean proactive compliance?
Yeah.
We know the current standards, but we don't know what's coming down the pike. Boom, here comes M2131. What are we going to do with that? Here comes NSM8, which is kind of the companion, right? What are we going to do with that? The question is, if you're doing security right, and if you're keeping your house in order, and you have good risk governance and security governance over your environment, these things don't surprise you.
Right.
But you've got to have, as you said, you've got to have those things in place. And a lot of folks don't understand the importance of investing into that early. Compliance is a function of the program. It's not its own program. And I think
absolutely
the longer people continue to treat compliance as it's its own separate thing, the longer we're going to continue to have that divergence, right? And the sets of skills that we use to manage compliance versus managing risk and doing all the cool guy stuff, threat hunting, red teaming, pen testing, forensics, investigations, et cetera, right? They're all referencing the same data sets.
Yes.
That's the thing that folks don't like to talk about and maybe don't recognize. Maybe that's why they don't talk about it as it's all the same data. There's no compliance data. There is no security data. There's no forensic data. It's all the same data. And I think as we're moving to the cloud, I think a lot of folks are starting to understand there isn't really a way to separate that data anymore. It's all there. It's in that tenant. It's all in the backplane. You getting it all is just a matter of how do you process it? What kind of lens do you put on it? And I think this cloud service providers are certainly leading the charge on that because, now everything's in the same spot. So it's become a lot easier. And we are seeing that out there with some of the providers in the compliance space who are recognizing that as well. But I think we're driving the charge here at Qmulos on this notion of converged continuous compliance where that automation is inherent in the program. Where you start with that on day one And maybe you don't have to onboard everything, right? You don't have to start with every framework, which is hard and it's daunting, but you can start with the idea. And I think once you get on the rails with this notion of inherent automation, converging security operations, all the cool stuff, right?
Yeah.
With your compliance functions and deriving all that insight from your data. I mean, take a baby step forward, right? Do just the basic few controls, see how it works. Yep. The more you start automating these compliance decisions, figuring out, as you said, what is the determination? How do you figure out that you're observing compliance state within these controls? The more you can automate out of that, and you kind of walk that automation model across and do kind of this automation with a conscience, right? It's not just automate everything. Automate all the things, right?
Right.
Let's talk about automating the things that need to be, and then actually give you value after you've automated them, not just for the sake of automation, right?
Absolutely. I have no qualms with machine readable controls and trying to integrate them and automate them to the greatest degree possible. I think everybody should be, expecting that we should have been there already and that is the way to go. However, I think that, like you said, with backing your way into a security program from the compliance standard, from the regulatory standard, causes a lot of problems. And this is one of the most interesting ideas that I've come across in the sort of world of compliance. Little esoteric, so we'll just stick with me, right? So the idea is that human beings are very bad about using metrics as surrogates for the thing that they're measuring. And this is a well-documented phenomenon in all kinds of spaces and domains, not just security. And it's effectively the idea that if you incentivize the metric, like sales quotas, then people will equate the quota with success rather than what the quota is supposed to be measuring, right? Quality sales, better sales, things like that. And if you attach incentives or punishments to those metrics, people will get very focused on those metrics, and that's typically not what you want them to do. I think that security and compliance is maybe more predisposed to triggering that effect in the human mind because, like with CMMC or PCI or any of these standards, if you don't meet that metric, that's it. Like, it's game over a lot of the times. You can't play in the playground anymore. And that is going to immediately trigger this surrogation effect where people say, I need to do this thing. Now, what happens is when you have a poorly written standard or a standard that is too prescriptive and then gets outdated by the threat landscape or technologies or anything like that, people will still use that subpar standard as a surrogate. And then eventually they will use it as a surrogate for the idea of security in general. And so what happens is they'll say, I'm compliant, therefore I am secure, not something that the standard that's not what the standard told you they were trying to do. We're trying to protect CUI over here for some reason, and you're using it as a surrogate for security. The security community then turns around and says, compliance is the problem. And so that sort of tells me two things. One is, if we know that people are going to focus on the standard, they're going to focus on the measurement of their compliance, and they're going to use that as the limit of what they consider to be secure, it isn't really a sustainable way forward to expect companies to just wake up and say, well, that's compliance, I need to do more. Because basic economics is going to tell business owners, what is my marginal return for everything that I'm going to do beyond what I'm required to do? For every dollar that I spend beyond hitting that wicket, what am I going to get? And generally, security is very bad about explaining what they're getting for those extra dollars, which is why the assurance part is so important. So we just say, well, that's compliance. Real security is over here in this la land. That's the real stuff. And the business owners go, well, what do I get for it? And then the security community goes, oh my God, how are we going to phrase this in the language that the business would understand? That becomes a back and forth, I think, that's unique organization to organization, industry to industry, CISO to CISO. However, if we put on our regulatory hat and we know that people are going to do this and most companies will do nothing else, that it is imperative on the regulators to write smarter regulations, to write smarter standards. Now that might be a pipe dream, but it's just one of those things where I think it's easier. It's an easier leverage point to say, we know people are going to do the minimum. Let's make the minimum better, than it is to say, let's keep the status quo minimum and hope that people just decide security is worth investing in one day. Because I think that would be nice. And I think you can do both. But I just think that writing better standards and writing better minimums is probably a better way to influence the broader ecosystem of compliance. That way we're not sort of, kicking ourselves over compliance when it's really just trying to provide assurance.
Do you suffer from seasonal compliance fatigue and chronic compliance headaches? You're not alone. Countless IT, compliance, and cybersecurity professionals just like you continue to suffer from legacy compliance, audit, and assessment workflows, excessive compliance paperwork, and manual evidence collection. Sadly, most have just accepted the idea that compliance management must always be difficult and unpleasant, but it doesn't have to be. Qmulos, an industry leader in converged continuous compliance, has developed revolutionary treatment options to relieve your compliance-related stress, delivering a fully automated end-to-end compliance experience. Don't delay. Call today for a free consultation with one of our compliance therapists and start your journey to converged continuous compliance by Qmulos. Call toll-free 1-844-476-8567 or visit Qmulos.com to start your healing journey. That's Qmulos.com. Qmulos, the compliance automation you need, the compliance experience you'll love.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the folks have kind of lost sight of what the purpose of compliance was ever meant to be, right? It is there to manage risk. And also, let's be honest. I think a little inside baseball, there's a little time for that too. It's a risk transfer mechanism as well.
Oh, yeah.
Just like with PCI DSS, the banks are offloading the risk to the merchants, and they're the ones who are left holding the bag because now we have a structure for it. It's not dissimilar from things like CMMC, right? We're trying to manage risk, but in the end, you look for somebody to blame, and you're going to say, look, these are the controls that failed, and this is why it happened. So let's get ahead of the threat, right? I think there's also this idea that compliance is this always, you're looking in a rearview mirror, right? It's always retroactive. We check on things that have already happened, right? We capture state, but it's retroactive. So how can you get on that same pace as the bad guys, right? How do we get inside their OODA loops, as we say, to operate on the same frequency that they do, right? They don't wait for the end of the quarter to look at that report, right? They're hacking now. They're making it now. So this idea that we can have some kind of a cadence, some periodic cyclical, review of our controls, and that gets us part of the way. If you want to know why people look at compliance derisively, it's that. All the, as we said, cool guy stuff, right? The threat hunting, the pen testing, the automated breach emulation and simulation, all of that is happening right now as we speak. Yep. Those processes are running 24/7. They never stop and never take a break. Compliance sort of goes in this cadence. We have this periodic cycle, and the bad guys don't wait for that checkbox to come through, right? As I've said it many times, hackers don't care about your checkboxes. They just don't care. And so you can send back fat ATO reports that go hundreds of pages. That doesn't matter, right? Yeah. The only people that care about it are the compliance people. Right. The bad guys don't. And so if it's ostensibly about managing risk, then we have to get on the same pace as the bad guys. How do we get there? Well, we have to operate on that same automation scale as our cool guy colleagues in the security space. That means automated collection, automated processing, automated analytics, automated reporting. There is no other way to do it because people just can't do it fast enough.
Right.
So,
yeah, absolutely. I mean,
and it's an asymmetric threat environment, right?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, these gigantic ATO reports, I don't think anybody thinks that that's effective, but it is an indication of what it's trying to do, right? In terms of the fact that if you just document all of your functionality, it doesn't do anything the second it's done being documented. However, somewhere in that document, there are pieces of assurance, and that's what we should try to go for. Because, for instance, you mentioned pen testing and threat hunting and all of this cool stuff that we get to do for security, right? Fundamentally, those are elements that are trying to provide assurances on a continuous basis, right? So
these are data points.
Exactly. And so they happen more often, and therefore they're seen more valuable. But it isn't just that they're happening more often that makes them valuable. They are attempting to verify something that's either in your ecosystem, internal, external, whatever the discipline happens to be, right? So from a formal engineering perspective, there is an entire discipline that is all about integration and testing, verification and testing. And I always find it funny when people go, oh man, we got to do real security, which is usually like the phrase that they use for the cool stuff, right? We got to do threat hunting and this and that. We got to do all this cool stuff. Definitely need to do that. But then they sort of put down compliance as if it's a separate thing in and of itself and not the other side of the coin. And I would just say, walk into any formal engineering firm, a mechanical engineering firm, an aerospace engineering firm, and go up to all of the verification and test engineers and tell them that they aren't real engineers, right? And you'll get laughed out of the room because like, what are you talking about? There are engineering requirements. We can't just have everybody building and fabricating stuff. We have to test it. You have to know if it's working. Sometimes that's, dynamically testing it. Sometimes that is not quite as interesting. But the idea of a verification and test is the same idea in my mind as assurance for security. And so it's not that it's different. It's just that it is the other side of the coin, and you have to speed both of them up in order to get the benefits. Currently, the cool stuff is way, way faster than the assurance side. But to throw the baby out with the bathwater and go, control standards and regulations and all of this stuff, there's no value there whatsoever. There's no value in assurance, I don't think is correct. I think it's a very, very hard problem, right? And it's like we were saying in the beginning, under-addressed, generally not all that interesting for most people, but it is, but sometimes hard problems are interesting because they're hard. And so whether it's sort of the continuous compliance idea, or there, like we said, there's all these ideas that are starting to emerge in the space. One or more of them is going to start to get the recipe right. But it's almost silly to just say, oh, compliance, or the even crazier part is people will say, oh, it's a checklist, as if there's something inherently wrong with checklists, right? It's what I always the metaphor that I always use. Do you remember the story of Captain Sully and they had to land the passenger jet in the Hudson River, like right after takeoff?
Yep.
So anytime that there's an emergency on board of an airplane, what do? Right? They pull out a checklist. They pull out a checklist. You know what doesn't happen? They don't turn around and say, oh man, I'm not really flying the plane, right? That would be ridiculous because the checklist is extremely important for assuring that we're doing the things that we need to do in specific scenarios, right? There's nothing inherently wrong with a checklist. If you want to get real close to home here and make some people uncomfortable, there isn't really a whole lot different between a checklist, standard operating procedure, and an IR playbook. And so if you're a fan of IR playbooks, there's nothing inherently wrong with checklists. There's something wrong with the way we're using the checklists in the domain of compliance. So this isn't, some miraculous revelation that's like, this is how we do it and fix it. But there's just so much energy that goes into this debate about security versus compliance and checklists and this and that. I'm like, it's missing the point. It's missing the point.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and that's kind of the idea of convergence. And also the reason we call the podcast series Compliance Therapy. It's kind of trying to get people to talk about this mental model of compliance and how they feel about it, really, because they do feel very poorly about compliance as a domain, as a practice. I mean, I don't think kids, who are coming up in security right now, they're dreaming of being, an information system security.
If they are, they need therapy, right?
Then they need therapy, correct, right? Then they need better mentorship, right? So people wind up in these roles and occasionally they get stuck in them forever. And there isn't a whole lot of career options when it comes to that.
Yeah,
I think it's also recognizing this from a workforce perspective, right? And kind of, bringing in the right diversity of talent, getting the right folks into the mix, giving them options, giving them opportunities to grow so you don't wind up in this kind of a paperwork shuffling function for the next 15, 20 years of your life. And, kind of like in that movie Office Space, it's nice to have that kind of job security for some folks, right? But in reality, folks in cyber tend to be pretty motivated. They want to grow. They want to learn more things.
Absolutely.
And you can learn all the frameworks you can, but ultimately just the role itself as it's defined today, the function as it's defined today, kind of relegates people into a set portfolio of skills, set portfolio of systems, and then they kind of churn and burn on that for years and years and years until they, find something else. And that's not a way to sustain a function that is considered to be pretty important. Look, I've been in organizations where when I ask them, how do you look at risk? And they say, well, let me walk you out to our risk organization. And they to their ISO cube farm with, 150 people in it. And I go, all right, so tell me how they make their decisions. And they go, well, this guy knows a lot about networking and this lady knows a lot about, firewalls. And so we kind of pass this stuff around to them according to I go, what's the consistency there?
Yeah.
Is there one? And they go, well, we do the best we can with the things that we've got. That's just not the way. If we say compliance is ultimately about risk management and assurance, then we have to get consistent. How do you get
100%?
Consistent?
Yeah. You need a framework.
One, and how do you get on the pace? Like we said, how do we shorten that time to understanding, time to insight, if you want to call it that, right?
Yeah.
And to understanding what the risk posture is, not just within one control, but writ large for the entire portfolio or for the org overall. These are hard problems that you said. And I think looking at them strategically, right? That's when we start to get into things like compliance strategy, which happens to be the title of my function.
Sure, yeah.
But, people go, how do you find that? Well, this is kind of it, right? This is the conversation that we're having, not only for an organization, but also for, let's say, a vendor or a consulting firm that's trying to address these problems for a client, and also at the level of government and regulatory bodies that set these standards. I think the missing piece is that implementation piece. Folks talk about, here's your guidance, here's your implementation objectives, and this is how you verify and validate that a control exists. But then that doesn't seem to have an overall programmatic approach. Right. It guides folks, but this is how you set up a program. This is how you have good risk governance practices that not only work, but also scale.
Right. Well, this is, all it is culture change. How hard could it be? Right.
Thank you.
We always joke, there's STIGs, right, in the sort of DoD space, security technical implementation guide. There's no STIG for culture, right? There's no radio button to select. There's no switch that you can flip. It is a slow grinding process, and maybe the understanding of compliance and assurance is maybe a little closer to what the culture of an organization is. We talked about at the beginning, they sort of assume with most standards that the culture is mostly in place, and when it's not, you have to reverse engineer a culture, and that is a very hard thing to do. You mentioned earlier about people getting into the field or sort of breaking into the field. We have negative unemployment in cybersecurity broadly, and like you said, GRC is really kind of the Hufflepuff of the Harry Potter houses among the options in security. However, I don't think that it's one of those things that should be written off if it can be improved. And I'm not convinced that it is a lost cause, especially because if you're looking for tracks to get into security, it's typically IT admin, SOC work. Those are two major areas. There's no reason why a better world of GRC can't be an inroad into the broader world of security. It is an important facet. It's just such a strange domain that hasn't kept up with what's going on. As we're sitting here talking about it, you're like, there's just so much room for growth in terms of, who knows what an entry-level GRC role will look like in 5 years. Think about how different the landscape could be, especially if you guys have anything to do with it. In 5 years, it could be a great way for people who are curious about that element first to get, into security as a domain, which I don't think anybody would argue is the bigger goal that everybody needs, because we definitely need as many people showing up as possible. I tell people that, as far as like my advice for trying to get into security is to figure out what they're curious about, because learning assembly in order to be a malware analyst could be as boring as trying to read NIST controls if you're not curious about it. If you're not into it, they might as well be the same thing. Now, there's a lot of people who happen to be curious about how controls work, how frameworks work. They are just predisposed for some reason to being curious about how that works. I find it very interesting. Is if I can be allowed to comment on the broader security community,
Please do.
such that it is, right? My observation is, as a community, it is such a unique and awesome group of people because we all look at problems as puzzles, right? They're like, how do I break this thing? How do I keep them from breaking this thing? How do I figure this out? And you're just sort of driven to continuously learn and figure things out. It's a wonderful trait of people sort of across the board who find themselves in security for whatever reason. What I find odd is that when it comes to compliance, so much of the community goes, ugh, I don't want anything to do with that. And you're like, is anyone curious about why it's so bad? Are you curious about like why, like how it got to this point? I mean, now that may probably not. There's probably not a lot of people who are, but some of us are. And I think that there's been some progress that's been made even in that short time compared to what's going on. So, who knows where it goes from there. As a quick example, within the CMMC space, I've been beating the drum for 3 years now that if you want to evaluate a vendor to know if they're going to help your compliance posture, right? It's not security, it's a surrogate, it's not ideal, but it is a starting point. Let's say you have an organization, there's lots of organizations like this, they don't have any logging, they don't have any backups, they don't have anything in place whatsoever. They have a requirement suddenly that says that they need to do something along those lines, and they don't know how to do it. So they turn to the marketplace to say, who's got a solution for me? And they don't know how to evaluate if that vendor is telling them the truth or what they need, or if it's the right fit. They're just sort of dealing with the claims of the vendor. The solution is to pick up 800-171A or 853A, the decomposed requirements for your security control, and you hold it up to the vendor and you say, can you tell me on this list what you do? And you make the vendors map to your decomposed requirements. So now all of a sudden you've turned the tables, right? You are asking the same question that an assessor or an auditor is asking you, but you are asking the vendors who really are going to be facilitating that functionality for you. But you're gaining assurances before you make the wrong investment. So it is not the case that compliance is always this pariah waste of time. I mean, we've seen this happening in the industrial base, that small businesses are defending themselves and making better investment decisions by adopting these methods and sort of using them in new ways, which I don't think most people working in GRC or compliance or whatever their understanding about it would say, we can weaponize compliance requirements to make better investments for small businesses, for companies that have very low security maturity. That definitely was not what they intended when they wrote 171, but these things emerge and change over time. So it might be a little idealistic, but I definitely don't think that it is time. I think it's a little too early to say that compliance is completely useless and there's no value there whatsoever.